welcome all of you. It's great to have some people in the room. Hi to everyone online. There's lots of people online. But it still is very special to be resuming in-person events. So thanks for coming out. And I thank you also for wearing your masks and for keeping those on. During the Q&A, if you have a question, you can take the mask off to ask that, and just give me a second to come to you with the mic. That way people who are watching online can hear your question. And for those who are watching online, feel free to put a question in the queue by finding the Ask a Question button that's at the bottom of your screen. And I will be looking at those questions and making sure that we get to both live questions and the written questions online. I want to mention that we have a few co-sponsors this evening for this event, and so my thanks go to the Center for Collaborative History, for the African American Studies Program, Department, it used to be a program, finally the Department, and the Humanities Council at Princeton. But on to our speakers. I've been looking forward to Keith Wailoo's new book, Pushing Cool, Big Tobacco, Racial Marketing, and the Untold Story of the Menthol Cigarette. Ever since he and I stood in line at Small World, and I got a brief description long before the pandemic. There's the elevator pitch and there's the Small World pitch. So ever since then, I've been eager for this book to come out and to get to celebrate it here with all of you. So I am also so pleased that the wonderful Ruha Benjamin behind me is here to discuss that book. With Keith Wailoo, a book about the making of racial and poverty markets in which to push menthol cigarettes. Keith Wailoo is Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton, as well as current President for the American Association for the History of Medicine, which is his chosen field of research and teaching and study, along with Anthony Fauci and others. He was just recently awarded the prestigious Dan Davis Prize. And even a partial list of his books will give you a quick sense of the scope of his work. They include Dying in the City of the Blues, Sickle Cell Anemia and the Politics of Race and Health, How Cancer Crossed the Color Line, and Pain, a Political History. And you can check them out back there. We could not have hoped for a more esteemed interlocutor. Ruha Benjamin is Professor of African American Studies at Princeton and the founding director of the Just Data Lab, as well as author of 2 books, People Science and Race After Technology. So Keith and Ruha's interests converge around a sustained interest in and concern with the relationship between health and justice. Pushing Cool Now, a book in Keith's words about urban transformation, social entrapment. This is a quote: urban transformation, social entrapment, exploitation, and the rise of a form of racial capitalism that resulted in the extraction of health from Black communities, was a timely and important book prior to the killing of George Floyd outside, as we learn, the best place in Minneapolis to buy menthol cigarettes, and prior to the disproportionate respiratory deaths from COVID of Blacks in America. But it has become impossible to read Pushing Cool Now divorced from these additional chokeholds on Black lives through police and the pandemic, nor, as I'm sure we'll hear, would Keith want us to. Please help me welcome our speakers for this important conversation.
Thank you, Dorothea. There's no introduction like a Labyrinth introduction. I've always been amazed for the last 7 years coming to Labyrinth events how deeply Dorothea engages the work that's going to be shared here. So a book is a conversation. It's a continuation of a conversation. I feel like I've been in conversation with Keith Wailoo and his work for almost 20 years. He doesn't know this because at first year as a graduate student, my professor, Troy Dester, assigned Dying in the City of Blues. And that was my first window into the history of medicine, and it really shaped my future dissertation work, which also involves sickle cell. And then I remember later in graduate school, he was coming to speak about how cancer crossed the color line, and they sort of tapped me as a graduate student, come and be a respondent. And he was gracious enough to put an acknowledgement of a thanks in the book, and I was like, what did I do? I didn't do anything. And so the conversation continues. About 6 years ago, Keith came to the African American Studies faculty grad seminar in the department across the street. And at that time, it was the early days of this project. And I remember him talking about this digital archive that I later learned has like 14 million documents. The tobacco truth industry documents, I think housed or at UCSF, which gives the public access to the private communications of industry insiders for the first time. And so I want to start by asking Keith just to tell us a little bit about what drew him to this project, and perhaps also in that, to share anything that stands out as shocking or perhaps disgusting in your engagement with this digital archive.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Dorothea, for the introduction and the invitation. And it is true that this is a project long in the making between the elevator pitch / cafe pitch and the seminar conversations. It's just incredibly satisfying to be at this point. And thank you, Ruha, for taking up my invitation to join us in conversation. So the archives are in fact shocking, and they're the byproduct of lawsuits that were brought by states' attorneys general and the Department of Justice against the tobacco industry in the late 1990s. And so one of the byproducts of any such lawsuit is a discovery process and the creation of a legal archive that was then, in the wake of the settlement, scanned, digitized, and made available at UCSF. And what's remarkable about it is that it allows a kind of pulling back the curtains on a corporation and its practices of marketing for over a century. And so in some ways, it's an unparalleled view into how markets not are found, but are made. Because of course, we as consumers just find the products that we find, we see advertising, but we don't really understand the extraordinary amount of work that's done to understand ourselves. Maybe in the age of Facebook and online marketing, when an ad pops up and you kind of sense that they know more about you than you imagined, this is not new information. But really to see the scale of thought and care that's done towards understanding markets and to create markets is what's phenomenal. So I thought I would, when you said like fascinating and disgusting, it's both off-putting to see the depth at which the industry tried to understand certain kinds of developments, like for instance, anxiety and the rise of the association between cancer and smoking. For many in the industry was a source of deep concern because it undermined smoking behavior and it drove people away from smoking. But the industry also employed social scientists, psychologists, to understand how people were coping with the new anxieties associated with the cancer news. And they understood that people were looking for safe cigarettes. They were looking for reassurance. They were looking for security. And they began to understand that products like menthol cigarettes and products like filtered cigarettes signified safety to people. And so it's the social scientists who worked in the industry that taught the industry how to market in a way that spoke to people's needs, fears, insecurities, and desire for security. And that's the story that is both off-putting and also simultaneously just fascinating to see. If I could just give you one example of that's a story about health anxiety. Here's the story about a document in the archive that tells you about the deep way in which the industry came to study race. And it's in the introduction, and it's a company called Computer Field Express that describes trying to locate a new menthol brand for Liggett and Myers. And as I write here, the business tactics that helped companies develop Black menthol markets were not specific to African Americans, yet the industry's commitment to understanding the African American social condition is at once fascinating and frightening. If their studies of Black life had been done by for any other purpose than for selling tobacco products, the depth of thought devoted to understanding race, the city, and society might be admirable. They studied the difficulties that Black people in cities confronted. They looked closely at the challenges of poverty, drug use, residential segregation, and urban decline, doing so to a remarkable degree. But their interest was not in ameliorating these social ills. Their brand of racial capitalism looked at urban distress and social vulnerability in search of opportunity. And the company that the study I write about in this passage is a study that's done in 1971, in which CFE's, Computer Field Express, endorses the idea that menthol branding should ride the tide of emerging so-called hard drug lifestyles in the city. They write, quote, "Cool has attracted a group of indolent, young, psychedelic, drug-taking Blacks," unquote. That's what their analysis for Liggett and Myers said. Liggett said. Cool had created, quote, "a drug franchise," as Liggett saw it, and had acquired an image of being, quote, "for drug-prone male Blacks, unambitious, loafing, and lazy in nature, with no interest in class." As I write, to understand Cool's appeal then was to understand this culture of drug use in the 1960s and 1970s. In their view, in Liggett's view, in CFE's view, LSD, heroin, and marijuana use were not social crises or a human problem. To understand these to these consultants, heroin use was a type of urban consumerism that suggested market synergies and opportunities. And so I'll just quote by CFE, they described the feel of menthol, the bite was heavy, pungent, icy, cooling taste. They saw this as a halfway house to marijuana and heroin. That is what they thought menthol meant to menthol smokers and to drug users. And in fact, drug users were telling them exactly this, that they saw a convergence between the feel of menthol and the high of marijuana. And as the analysts explain further, Cool has the sense sharpening, the feel that is the essence of menthol's narcotic image. For Black people in the drug culture, CFE said, they might even be lured to a new menthol brand that spoke unabashedly to this situation. Quote, "We know that a direct, non-subtle approach to advertising pretty much works." And so they suggested that a brand called Halfway is a possible name for a new brand. And as I write, if Cool was already a halfway house to other forms of drug use, and if Cools were already integrated into marijuana and heroin drug cultures, then why not make a pitch explicitly in a new menthol brand? This is the kind of thinking. Now, of course, there was no product called Halfway that was produced, but it's studies like this of the intimate understanding of drug use that are just all throughout this archive, that give you a sense of both the fascination and the frightening nature of the studies that were sustaining and building menthol markets. So that's a long introduction, but it gives you a sense of the feel of the documents in this archive.
Yeah, it's one of the most shocking aspects, I think, especially of the introduction. And for me, it underscores this idea that racism or racist practices aren't simply born out of ignorance, out of a not knowing, but out of a distorted form of knowledge. And the complicity of social scientists, we'll come back to that, but it runs throughout and has implications today for the kinds of university industry collaborations that are encouraged. And we'll talk more about that. I will say that one of the most important interventions for me is how pushing Cool denaturalizes race by showing how the racial affinity linking Black folks to menthol cigarettes was produced or pushed over time. So as a starting point, you take us to before this affinity was established, showing how initially menthol cigarettes were branded as a therapeutic alternative, as you mentioned already, one with a health promise in the midst of growing anxieties around cancer. You also show how the banning of TV and radio ads for cigarettes led the industry to billboard advertising, specifically in urban neighborhoods. So can you give us a little more of this tour, the social history that explains why, quote, Black folks love menthol so much? And we put that in quotes because it's something that you pick apart throughout.
Yeah, so what I say in the prologue is that I became familiar with menthol marketing and menthol ads in the 1970s when I was a kid in Bronx and Queens. But little did I know that I was coming into the menthol story in chapter 3, which is the chapter 3. I was born into chapter 3, but chapters 1 and 2 have little to do with race. In fact, if in 61, I was born in 62, so if in 1962, you had said to a tobacco executive or a social scientist or a researcher, oh yeah, there's an affinity between Black people and menthols, and they would look at you and they would say, this doesn't make any sense. There is no such, because we know at that time, they would say that the affinity for menthol is a health affinity. That is to say, the people who are leaning towards menthol smoking are people who are health conscious, anxious, and they're evading the cancer problem by looking for a compromise cigarette. And the compromise is mentholated smoking. And it's that feeling of coolness in the throat, the feeling of your airways opening, when in fact it doesn't open. Menthol is what physiologists and others call a trick upon the senses. It gives you the feel of having an open airways and a feel of cooling of the throat. There's no temperature change in your throat at all. In fact, this year, I don't know whether you paid attention to the Nobel Prize in medicine and physiology, I guess it was. The Nobel Prize went to scientists who study menthol and pepper, and cayenne pepper, and study the sort of the trick, the brain, the sort of the trick upon the brain that these substances are. They give you a sense of having a hot mouth or a cool throat, but the temperature of your mouth and your throat has not changed at all. How does that work? Well, this is what menthol does. And so the menthol market emerges as this niche product for people who are smoking and have parched throats, or smoking during cough and cold season, and are literally looking for a therapeutic feeling as an alternative to smoke. So one of the early menthol ads says, when April showers make you cough like crazy, refreshing cools taste fresh as a daisy. Got a cough? Switch from hots to cools as your steady smoke. So that's how menthol emerges and builds, and the cancer scare expands the menthol market along with filtered smoking. And it's really in 1964, at a time when the industry is under stress for marketing to youth, increasing regulations are constraining their ability to market to youth, that they begin to pivot to look for other growth markets. And it's Brown and Williamson and its Cool cigarette that first begins this really aggressive push in the wake of the Surgeon General's report in 1964. So I'm actually able to track the emergence of this Cool strategy of building urban inner city markets to the summer of 1964, when the industry begins to pivot into Black periodical marketing in an aggressive fashion. And it's also a time period when the city is changing demographically. So with white flight and the demographic transformation of cities, the industry starts to see Black people in cities as more captive markets. So it's a convergence of a new health threat, demographic change, other markets being closed off, that pivot the industry, first Brown and Williamson, and then there's this kind of mad rush of other companies into the city to commandeer and to build what they regard as growing what one company calls poverty markets. So it's a long answer to your question of where that pivot happens and why it happens when it does.
Thank you. In many ways, pushing cool is a cautionary tale about the perverse underside of targeted or tailored marketing. And I personally couldn't help think about the saturation of targeted marketing in our own digital lives today. So I was wondering, are there any lessons from menthol cigarettes that can help us discern the difference between Blaxploitation and Black economic empowerment? And do you think in our context now, do you think we should be thinking about it in terms of consumer rights, civil rights, or some other framework for advocacy?
Well, that is such a hard question to answer, because the folks who have helped the menthol market build and be sustained have often done it in the name of empowerment and civil rights. So one of the ways in which the menthol market was built in the 1960s and beyond is through the partnerships with civil rights organizations. So there's this elaborate trade-off whereby the industries are leaving the city and the tobacco industry stays to cultivate these markets and builds relationships with organizations like the NAACP. There's a meeting in the Dorset Hotel in 1964 where representatives of CORE, the Congress for Racial Equality, meet with tobacco people from Brown and Williamson, and they're interested in, as the civil rights movement is picking up steam, there's a question about leveraging consumerism for impact and equality, right? So the whole logic of an economic boycott is one in which African Americans are saying, we buy your products and we will boycott your products unless your industry embraces equal opportunities of employment. So a lot of the civil rights organizations see any consumerism among Blacks as the opportunities for economic leverage. And so they look at the tobacco industry the same way they look at the auto industry, the same way they look at any other industry, and they say, in the Dorset Hotel, not jobs, but in this case, they actually argue that the industry needs to employ more African American models and people in advertising to show that but to show African Americans not in a menial light, but in a light that represents aspirations. So there are these complex trade-offs that happen literally in back rooms that also, and another example is the publisher John Johnson of Ebony magazine, who is interested in projecting and speaking to an aspiring, rising middle-class Black consumer population and readership, but is also interested in advertising revenue. And so there's this one moment in my book which gives you a sense that while mainstream magazines are beginning to criticize the tobacco industry because of the health implications of long-term smoking, Ebony runs I could read a portion of it, but it's the death of Nat King Cole in 1965. Singer who is renowned for Mona Lisa and a number of other major hits, and a crossover star, but an avid smoker, and develops lung cancer in late 1964, has multiple operations. And when he dies, Ebony runs a very thoughtful and deeply meaningful reflection on his life, his civil rights commitments, and also his cancer. It doesn't mention once smoking. But also in Ebony magazine, there are 4 advertisements for different menthol brands in that same issue. And so there's a kind of a politics of silence. So you asked about kind of the mix of civil, fighting for sort of blaxploitation and economic empowerment. And the problem with the history of menthol is that these things are difficult to disentangle. And at different times in menthol's history, you have African Americans taking different sides on this question. So when RJR in 1989 comes out and says, we're going to market a new menthol called Uptown, specifically to Black people, you have, on the one hand, Louis Sullivan, who is a Republican and a member of, he is the Secretary for Health and Human Services in the Bush administration, a business-friendly administration, who calls out RGR and says, this is a sick and sinister plan that undermines the health of Black Americans. But who comes to the defense of RJR? Benjamin Hooks, the executive director of the NAACP. And ultimately, Louis Sullivan wins that fight. And in fact, it's a turning point because it shows the rising power of, you might say, African-American advocates who are concerned more about the health implications of menthol smoking than the kind of the symbols of empowerment that the industry has been able to cultivate. So it's a long answer to your question, but it's a very complicated struggle that continues to this day, like actually today, because the FDA is in court being pushed today by advocates who are saying you're moving too slow, while there are also advocates who are arguing that, to ban menthol cigarettes would be to have a detrimental impact on like the policing of African-American men. So it's playing out at this moment, although we're at a different moment in history where my sense is that the advocates for banning menthol have gained the upper hand.
Right, and I promise you we'll bring the conversation back to today and the current ban debates. But first I want to dive just a little bit deeper into different aspects of the book. One of the key terms or lenses that runs throughout the text is this idea of racial capitalism, which Keith describes as the long-term extraction of health and wealth from Black communities where big tobacco exploits unstable situations for profit and creates opportunities out of crises. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about how menthols is an exemplary of the broader story of racial capitalism.
So I would say that I've given you some insight using something like Ebony magazine, the tangled web of the need for advertising revenue to sustain Black periodicals that themselves have a positive overall impact on the image of African Americans and speak to a kind of aspiring, rising economic social station. But at the same time, with these kinds of trade-offs that also encourage and are silent about the devastating health impact of smoking. And so you might say that's one aspect of racial capitalism and the trade-offs associated with capitalism in the city, the sort of buying of silence. There are other aspects of race and capitalism that have to do with the way in which the industry thinks about captive markets and poverty markets as, in some ways, isolated and also vulnerable to its message of empowerment, and finds supporters who help to amplify that message, notwithstanding the long-term devastating impact of smoking over the long period. So there's this combination of promise of empowerment mixed with long-term health deficits that come out of it. And I wanted to read you this this one passage from one of my chapters on urban hustles and suburban dreams that captures some element of this. Because as the industry is creating this urban marketplace, they're also making the argument that this is personal choice that's driving this. And there's a debate that unfolds in cities in the 1980s about, well, what kind of empowerment is this? And the Detroit Times does a piece where they interview lots of people, and one of the people interviewed is an advertising executive named Gene Morris, who says that racism and segregation had been allowed this exploitative system to flourish, feeding on neglect and racial disdain, and offering false hope in the form of commodities like malt liquor and menthol cigarettes. And he's quoted as saying, Blacks, quote, since they came to this country, have been told that they were inferior, lazy, stupid. As a way to compensate, Black people look for ways to make positive statements about themselves, ways to say they're doing well and can afford luxuries like other people. And this is kind of a theory that John Johnson at Ebony had, which is that African Americans in a segregated racist society look for what he calls commodities that signify compensatory gratification. That is, if you can't go to segregated institutions on vacation, and if you can't buy houses in segregated neighborhoods, in white-only neighborhoods, then you look for other ways to signify great rising status. And so symbols and commodities and consumer commodities are the vehicle by which one gains that sense of gratification. And so this was a really common thing to think about in the advertising and marketing industry. And there are people within the industry that understand this and kind of shape messages along those lines. So what I write at the end of this chapter is the billboard era that flourished is not just about the presence of these billboards, but the message in the billboard captured this kind of dilemma in vivid pictures. And when anti-billboard activism increased in the 1980s, NAACP spokesperson James Williams defended the industry and accused critics of racism, noting, quote, it's racist to say Black people are so malleable that they don't have the sense to decide whether or not to smoke. One leader for RJR was a gentleman named Benjamin Ruffin. Benjamin Ruffin had incredible credibility in the Black community because he was the former student of the North Carolina Central University during the days of civil rights sit-ins. But he was also a close ally with Benjamin Hooks. And Ruffin liked to quote his friend, the NAACP director, saying, the main thing tainted about money that we receive from some sources is that there tain't enough of it, right? So this is the dilemma that, that created the phenomenon of this kind of racial capitalism dilemma. And I'll end by reading how I conclude the chapter, because as Big Tobacco's web was thickening, health activists and local organizers were awakening to the deadly irony of this predatory exploitation. Reaching for a graphic metaphor, an African-American woman named Pam Miller of the American Lung Association in 1988 explained that Big Tobacco's racial capitalism had enticed Black communities in a deadly snare. It was as if a Black family had a terrible accident, she said, while driving. Quote, the car overturns, and the wife and children are pinned in the car. Another car arrives, and with it the promise of help. Quote, it's the KKK pickup truck. The KKK rescues the family, she says, and the father is very thankful to the KKK. And this was her metaphor for describing the situation of African Americans in cities confronted with the tobacco industry. Urban Black smokers were caught, as I write, in a tragic hustle, a fatal bind indeed.
Heavy. So one of the first things that I learned as a student of sociology was that this thing we think of as our personal taste for, whether it's taste for food, taste for music, taste for fashion, isn't natural or inherent to us, but it's socially, politically produced. But I've never actually read a book that goes into this much detail, showing with vivid detail and complexity how that production of taste, whether it's for menthols or something else, is created. We learned that the story of Black menthol addiction isn't simply this top-down process, the big bad boogeyman. They're there in the story, but it's really this web of influencers. And I love Keith's use of that term influencers because it reminds us that it's not some phenomenon of social media personalities, but it has a long genealogy. And so there's two categories of influencers that interest me most. We've heard a bit already about Black influencers, whether we're talking about NAACP, whether we're talking about Ebony. But I want to spend a little time talking about the complicity of social scientists in this story. There are many moments where I had to put the book down and process what I was reading about this kind of coaching of the industry by social scientists. Again, it reminds me of what's happening in some ways with the role of ethical advisors to big tech today. In one place, he says that the depth of the studies of Black life would be admirable rather, if only they were being done solely, not done solely to sell tobacco. But my favorite, I would say, most powerful moment came when he wrote, quote, "Over time, the industry dedicated vast resources to a peculiar kind of race studies, a perverse mirror of the type of multidisciplinary university scholarship that gave rise to the academic field of African American studies." Ouch. So I wonder if you can unpack that statement and just talk a little bit more about the role of academics or social scientists and researchers in this.
Yeah, this is a great question. So this is the thing I must say I was taken aback by. Maybe the very first time I looked into the archive, we're used to telling students there is the academic study of gender, race, sexuality, and then there's the world of business. And the idea that within the business world, there are social scientists who are using the tools of urban ethnography, who are using the tools of social psychology, who are using all of the tools of Black studies to both understand and create markets. So the analogy I use is there's a really interesting book by a literature scholar called FBIs, FBEYES. And it looks into the FBI and how FBI researchers read Black literature throughout the 1930s and 1940s, because of course they did, right? They did because they wanted to understand the elemental nature of Black protest. They wanted to understand social unrest, and they studied literature to understand the social dynamics. It was a form of surveillance and espionage. And they also wrote a counter literature within the FBI. So when I read this book, it occurred to me that this is the world that I'm looking at of social scientists in the industry are kind of like people who they're doing Black studies. They're looking at issues like social structure. They are, and on the question of taste, they also understood that taste, they knew, whatever we want to say about taste, they understood that people didn't smoke brands because of taste. They might tell you they did, and the reason I know that is that the one company that was never really successful with the menthol brand was Philip Morris. And they studied the hell out of why they couldn't create a successful menthol brand. And what they did was like, okay, the myth is that Black people prefer to higher menthol, which is why they smoked cool. And women were interested in lighter menthol because of hygiene reasons, which is why they pivoted towards white women, towards Salem. And Philip Morris studied, used blind studies to try to figure out whether people had actual preferences aligned with identity. And what they said, and it's a wonderful comment, they say, tobacco preference, taste it's not, people's own statements about what they prefer are not veridical. They're not true. People don't, if you blind them and have them taste two different tobaccos, they have no clue what they're tasting. They couldn't tell you high menthol from low menthol. And the reason is that a lot of the taste from tobacco comes from the kind of tobacco that's used, not necessarily from the menthol. So they struggle to try to understand this relationship between taste and identity, and they say it's all about imagery. It's about marketing. It's about brand and identity. It's not about taste. So they're undermining this idea of the connection between inherent identity and taste. And the social scientists also spend a lot of time thinking about things like status anxiety, which is a big term in the 1950s. So I'll quote you one character who shows up in my book, Ernest Dichter, the founder of a company called the Institute for Motivational Research. And in 1961, really before this trend, he writes about the Negro market as, in particular, has been a fruitful outlet for many status products. The natural desire to achieve equality has prompted the Negro consumer to the extensive purchase of products seen as being indicative of a raised socioeconomic and cultural level. But it's interesting that at that moment in 1961, he was not talking about filtered cigarettes. He was not talking about menthols. He was talking about filtered cigarettes. He says filtered cigarettes represent such a product. So throughout this archive, what you find is urban sociologists, students of social structure and influence making. Another document that I'll very quickly mention is this shocking study in 1967 St. Louis, done by a company which is trying to understand how you not just study taste preferences, but how you create taste preferences. And they study African-American street corner culture and in St. Louis, in Black St. Louis. And they point out that young Black men in particular don't watch as much television as young white men do. In fact, they find, they look to influencers on the street. It might be a barber, it might be a bellhop, it might be a taxi driver. And these are the people who are called kingfishers. They're people of influence in the community. And the way you establish new preferences, this is RJR study for Camel cigarettes, Camel menthols, is that you impart prestige to those influencers by giving them what's called boast material, as in like free samples. And it's through that process that you are imparting both prestige, but you're also shaping behavior. And so it's basically like pushing drugs, right, on the street corner in order to kind of create preferences. And so it's all of these kinds of studies of social structure, of where people get influence. They study perception of billboards and attitudes toward billboards. If we have time, I'll read you a little bit of a study that Philip Morris does about why Black men, and it intersects with issues of sexuality, masculinity, and menthol, why Black men don't care about cowboys, about the Marlboro cowboy, and why you can't just take a cowboy and make him Black and put him on a billboard. But it's a very sophisticated understanding.
Unless he's Idris Elba.
What's that? That's right, exactly. Right. Anyway, I'll come back to that.
Yeah, we should talk about Black cowboys. Okay, so as we move towards conclusion, I'd love us to talk a little bit about this menthol ban that's upon us, thinking about where this movement came from, including the role of vigilante defacement of billboards and public health activism, and how that resistance against big tobacco expanded to where we are today, which is on the precipice of a national ban.
I would say that by the late 1980s, there is more of a consensus in the medical and public health world that smoking is unambiguously detrimental to health. I mean, if you look back at the medical and public health literature of the 1930s and 1940s, it's ambiguous at best, or it's ambivalent. Even in the 1960s, as I said, there's this sense that there's a trade-off between economic empowerment and health. But by the 80s, I think the public health community and the medical community has swung really forcefully in the direction of smoking being unambiguously detrimental. And the Uptown controversy emerges at that very moment, where RGR says, well, if Nike can market seekers directly to Black kids, why can't we market a new product directly to Blacks and say we're doing that? And in some ways, they pull the curtain completely away. Instead of all of this being implicit and behind the scenes, they essentially say, we're just going to do this, and we're going to defend it, and they weren't prepared for the backlash. And that backlash actually produced local activism. At the same time, some of these communities that had seen the proliferation of billboards dominating their city, detrimental to the health of their kids, began to engage in vigilante behavior. So a guy named Henry McNeil Brown became widely known, he called himself Mandrake, and he went around Chicago whitewashing and blackwashing alcohol and tobacco billboards, and that was echoed and picked up in Philadelphia, in New York City, in Dallas, in Detroit. And so there's a kind of combination of local activism, public health activism that builds steam, that leads towards the tobacco settlement, the suit against tobacco, where states attorneys generals, their rationale for taking on the industry was that they were now dealing with taking care of people who had smoked over their entire lives, who were on Medicaid, and now the state was paying for the healthcare associated with long-term smoking. And so they were trying to recoup. So there's a whole set of reasons why a lot of interests were now aligned against the industry that ultimately led to you don't see billboards around anymore, because one of the consequences of the settlement was the banning of the billboards. So you might say that's the beginning of where we are today, leading towards the ban. The last thing I'll say is in 2009, Barack Obama is elected president. The Democrats control the House and the Senate. And in 2009, there's a piece of legislation passed, which for the first time in US history gives the Food and Drug Administration jurisdiction over tobacco products. That shows you the power of the industry over the course of the 20th century, that tobacco was deemed to be neither food nor drug and beyond FDA regulation. So what we're living with now is the history that's unfolded since 2009 of what should the FDA do now that it's been finally granted authority over tobacco products and specifically menthol.
So we have a few minutes, I think, for questions via Zoom and the audience. So I'm going to turn things over to Dorothea.
Thanks to both of you. It's a lot to sit with, and it's a lot to process. The degree of perniciousness in the story is really staggering, and takes a moment to assimilate. But if you have a question, I'll come to you with the mic. If you have a question you're watching online, put it in the queue with the ask a question button. Over here.
I was interested to hear your comments about the blind test, and because of my early years out of college before I found my real calling, I did a lot of those tests with unbranded cigarettes, unbranded soft drinks. I was always very fascinated by the fact that when we put Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, and Royal Crown Cola without labels, Royal Crown won every time, but they couldn't make it in the market. I guess my question is in view of big tobacco's ability to very quickly pivot and for opportunities, how do you see, what do you foresee their role as the marijuana market continues to grow and ultimately I think would be a very good prospect for them, and how might that impact African Americans in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't really have an answer. I've spent, the conclusion of the book talks more about the vaping industry and the e-cigarette and the way in which the industry has pivoted into a relationship with and ownership of over e-cigarettes. But I have not thought, to be honest, about the way in which, and I don't have a privileged insight into how the industry regards the marijuana market as it's emerging. In some ways, the marijuana market is, it has its own history and logic, and as such may not be as amenable to the kind of manipulations that we see, but that's just a kind of quick thought about the marijuana market. What's interesting is to watch how the short history of vaping has in a very short period of time replicated the story that I told you about the tobacco and menthol in particular, which is it emerges as a health product, as in like, this will help people to quit smoking. But in fact, if you pull the curtain back, it's really a vehicle for widening nicotine addiction. And the vaping industry, Juul in particular, has played that game very carefully. And the FDA is itself not certain about how to proceed with regulating that product. So the two issues, how to regulate vaping and how to regulate the menthol cigarette, flavored cigarettes, are still unfolding hand in hand.
Maybe while you think, I'll link up to that question a little bit with a question of my own. Whether it's a marijuana market or something in the pharmaceutical industry, we know that something is going on today that is an equivalent of creating a racial market, but the barber and the bellhop now have Instagram and maybe a YouTube channel, right? So what will the future archive look like, and will we be able to even begin to untangle the stories of manipulation in the marketplace around race that's going on today, given also what you're asking about the fact that in a digital age, this might work differently?
So I was just chatting with Ruha about this, and Ruha was saying, given the nature of influence making today, let's say via Facebook, and we're in an age now where we're beginning to see the kind of regulatory interest in Facebook and information technology. Ruha was asking, is it going to be another 40 years before we realize what has been happening? Or do we need another class action lawsuit? In other words, because in some ways, the story that I'm telling is only a story that is tellable since 1998, because of the availability of records. The one you mentioned, the pharmaceutical industry, the lawsuits that were brought against Purdue Pharma for marketing OxyContin has also produced a comparable archive that both Hopkins and UCSF are collaborating on digitizing. And right now, the funny thing is that I'm on their advisory board because they're interested in how to make that archive available and usable so that people can see the machinations that produce markets. So in some ways, if you take the tobacco story and you marry it to the Purdue Pharma story, maybe we have the basis for understanding a lot more, but it may take a long time before we are actually able to see what's going on in Facebook, unless there is the kind of surveillance and kind of regulatory action that allows us to see it clearly.
So there's a hand in the back, and then maybe we'll wrap up and continue informally.
Thank you. I guess my question was inspired by what you were saying near the beginning, that there's often a connection between medicine and culture, and oftentimes there's a conflict between medical practices in minority communities with Western medicine, and oftentimes I was wondering, as a health professional, how do you think that should be handled, where it shouldn't be Western medicine, basically pushing onto minority medicine, but also there needs to be, a valuing of science-based medicine, and that conflict can happen in interesting ways, I think.
So tell me a little bit more about what you mean with regard to where do you see the kind of Western medicine in this story?
I suppose just what you're saying about how menthol cigarettes became connected to the Black community as a symbol of culture. And I suppose that reminded me of ways in which, off the top of my head, acupuncture, things like that, in Eastern medicine are sometimes looked down upon in a way that is sometimes hard to disentangle from the racial and, tones of that.
Yeah, the way I would say, so the proliferation and expansion of menthol smoking, I would say, isn't what I would call, homegrown. It's not. This is more of what the industry documents allow us to see is how that kind of affinity is manufactured, is created. But if we were not able to look behind the curtain, we might believe that this taste just emerges out of this natural affinity between people and products. So I would say that this case is not a good analogy with things like practices that emerge kind of, I wouldn't say organically, or emerge out of communities because it expresses something about longstanding group identity and group beliefs about the management of health. That said, it does become clear, especially in, let's say, the 1960s, that some African-American users of menthol would talk about growing up using menthol products and carrying with it a therapeutic association. But that too is something that wasn't specific to Black folks. It was really, and so the last thing I'll say about the argument for banning the menthol cigarette, which is I believe it should be banned, many people say, well, it should be banned because of the long history of targeted racial marketing. And others argue that it should be banned because it's a starter product that entices people to start smoking, especially young people. I would add to that it should also be banned because of the long history of a deceitful health pitch that has both built the market for menthol smoking from an early date and remains implicit in menthol marketing really through the 1990s and still today. And I know that because I see the social scientists and the psychologists and the marketing specialists in the industry studying it. And so that, to me, especially given the FDA's jurisdiction over health products, is in some ways the third and third and significant argument for banning the menthol cigarette.
it's so nice and so rare to see a historian actually come into the present day and take a political stance. It doesn't happen all the time. So one more thing that maybe should be said about this book is that it's such a complex story, but it's told with so much generosity towards the reader. You really bring the reader along to build an understanding. So it's a fabulous book. It's been a wonderful talk. I'm just going to invite you to, if you want a book and want to get it signed, we can do that now, and then you can pay for that upstairs on your way out. But please join me in thanking our wonderful guests.
Thank you.